I'm Father Jeffrey Mickler of the Society of St. Paul, a religious congregation in the Catholic Church made up of brothers and priests who in 30 countries spread the gospel through the use of media. Today I would like to share with you a few thoughts on our patron, St. Paul, and his temperament, his personality. What type of human being was he? First of all, we could see that he was an individual who was driven throughout his life. He was a doer. He was a person of action. When he was studying under Gamaliel, it wasn't enough for him to learn the Torah and the laws of God. He wanted to defend them. And he took matters in his own hands, trying to prevent the spread of the gospel of Jesus Christ, which proclaimed Jesus as the Messiah. He did not see it. There was no way in his mind that the Messiah could die on a cross. And certainly he did not believe that Christ had risen from the dead. He wanted to deliver people from this error by any means possible. So he persecuted the early Christian community. But on the road to Damascus, in a flash of light, he had his life turned around. He encountered the resurrected Christ and knew him, therefore, to be the Messiah. Paul was a person who was never lukewarm. He would be either hot or cold. And he was filled with a desire to tell everyone this saving story. Paul and his life decided to spread the gospel from place to place, and he realized from the letter to the Galatians that he was probably destined to do this from his mother's womb. That's reminiscent of the call of Jeremiah or John the Baptist. The special call of God to individuals from the moment of their conception to do something unique and powerful in the service of the divine. Now Paul, being driven by his convictions, was a mover. He was a person that embodied the missionary spirit. He wanted to move from place to place, town to town. And in doing that, he had an adaptable spirit, too. He was able to distinguish between what was essential and what was non-essential. Therefore, in spreading the gospel, he realized that many of the Jewish practices and customs that he had cherished and loved all of his life would not be suitable to spreading the story of Jesus to the Gentile world, and really had become, in so many ways, irrelevant. However, he did embrace the basic morality that he received from Judaism, the 10 Commandments, and the 2 great laws of love of God and love of neighbor. Paul was a person of great feeling and emotion, and you could see that in the Acts of the Apostles and in his writings as well. In the Acts of the Apostles, at Miletus, the Christians come down to greet him for one last time. And they're all weeping and hugging him and kissing him. They didn't want to let him go. And he expressed similar emotions towards them. He was a person of affection as well as action. You could also see this in the Romans letter, the final chapter, where he tells the Christians, be sure to greet one another with a holy kiss. He was not one of the untouchable types of personalities. But with that warmth, with that emotion, also came something of a temper. And we could see that in the Acts of the Apostles, where he had a very bitter conflict with Barnabas. Barnabas had a different type of personality. Barnabas' very name means the son of encouragement. And when they were preparing for the second missionary journey, Barnabas wanted to bring Mark along with them, and Paul said no. Mark had betrayed them, in Paul's opinion, on the first missionary journey and went home too soon. Barnabas said, let's give him a second chance. They couldn't agree words were exchanged, and Barnabas and Mark went one way, and Paul and Silas went the other. We could also see in his writings, there are times when it seems like there's fire coming off the page. In a letter to the Galatians, he begins by saying, "You fickle Galatians, why have you changed the gospel that you have received? I taught you that you were free in Christ and did not have to follow all of the kosher laws of Israel. You find your salvation in Christ. And yet now you're going back to following the ways of Judaism that you had never embraced before." And so he could be very stern with the readers of his letters because he loved them. He cared for them. In the letter to the Thessalonians, he writes that when I was in your midst, I was as gentle as a mother nursing a child. What a wonderful image. He didn't try to force people to accept the gospel of Christ, but he invited them to accept Jesus as the Messiah of Israel and indeed the world. And so you'll see peppered throughout his writings a lot of emotion, a great deal of feeling. Now Paul, in his journeys and in his writings, preaching and teaching, was a person who understood that there was something marvelous happening in the midst of this world, and he was a part of it. This conviction strengthened him for the trials and the sufferings he had to undertake. One of the things that Paul seemed to lack in the way of virtue, perhaps, was patience in the normal sense of the word. We say, "Oh, I have to practice more patience," which means putting up with other people's foibles, overcoming our own faults, etc. That's a rather small view of patience. Paul was patient in the sense he was waiting for the world, waiting for his fellow Jews to accept Christ. He was patient in that sense, but he had a sense of urgency about him. So that when he would come to a town, a village, a city, people would be drawn to him as a man of conviction. They would like to listen to his stories. The stories not only of Jesus, but the stories of what was happening in his life. And in these stories, they discovered a man of great courage. And this would be the virtue of virtues for Paul. He would list on occasion all the sufferings he went through. The shipwrecks, the beatings, the stonings, the imprisonments. And through it all, he did not panic. Through it all, he was a person of conviction, knowing that God was with him, and if that was the case, there was nothing else to worry about. And beyond all of that, he was a person that so loved the people and the churches that he knew that he had one thing on his mind: their salvation and their growth in the Lord. That anxiety for the churches was his greatest burden and greatest cross. And that anxiety for the churches was one of the many expressions of his love for people. Love, the virtue that he understood so well and that he wrote about, but more importantly, he lived. I hope that you'll have a virtuous life, that you'll take your basic personality and put it at the service of the Lord of life. God bless you.